what's going on and everything. All right, good evening, everyone. I've got 6:05 on my clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. First, I just want to make sure that the folks online can hear us okay. So if you could let us know if we're coming through all right for our audio.
I told them in the chat to raise their hand.
You got a hand raised.
Got a hand.
Okay, so I believe we're good to go audio wise. So we'll go ahead and move forward. So again, good evening. My name is Terry Fletcher. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. I want to welcome everyone to the DEP's first of 3 public meetings related to outreach for the U.S. Department of Energy's Methane Emissions Reduction Program grant for marginal conventional wells. With me tonight is staff from the DEP's Office of Oil and Gas, including Chief James Martin, Deputy Chief Jason Harmon, and Abandoned Well Plugging Program Manager Alana Hartman. And also joining us is staff from the DEP's Office of Environmental Advocate, including Advocate Ed McGuire and Deputy Advocate Dennis Stottlemyre. The purpose for this public meeting is to provide information, answer questions related to the MERP grant, and give you the opportunity to share your comments and inputs on how to prioritize marginal conventional wells in the state. Marginal conventional wells are idle or low-producing oil and gas wells that may pose environmental and safety risks, but still belong to a responsible owner. And the Inflation Reduction Act provides significant funding to help states plug and reclaim these wells. This meeting has a virtual option and is being recorded, so we will post the recording to the agency's website on Friday, November 8th, and we will notify everyone in attendance of when that posting is made. As we mentioned in our press release for this meeting, DEP is not asking for input on which wells to plug, but rather on the criteria or parameters that should be used in a formula to prioritize which wells need to be addressed first. These wells are still owned by responsible parties, but they may present environmental and safety risks due to their low production and inactivity. And the goal of this meeting is to hear from the public, including community representatives and leaders, well operators, anyone with concerns about wells near sensitive areas such as schools or hospitals. The final criteria and prioritization model will be established by the DEP's Community Benefits Committee. And please note that your input can be submitted anytime through 5 p.m. on November 14th, 2024. And you can submit your comments to DEP-MERP, MERP at wv.gov. We're going to start the meeting with a brief presentation from Deputy Chief Jason Harmon, and then we'll open the floor for questions and your comments. Thanks for bearing with me through those opening remarks. I'll now turn the floor over to Jason Harmon. Jason.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, everybody in attendance, both in person and virtually. My name is Jason Harmon, and I am the Deputy Chief and have been in this role since 2014. Most recently, I was involved in the Abandoned Well Plugging Program, and we have hired somebody to help me out with that who you'll be getting to know well. So today, as Terry said, we are soliciting information from you about the methane emission reduction program grant criteria. We are charged by DOE with developing criteria to determine which wells get funded and which don't. So this part of this meeting is to solicit feedback from community representatives and whoever would like to have a voice on how it is that we prioritize those wells. A couple housekeeping notes. Right now, everybody online is in viewer mode. If you have a comment, please raise your hand. We will promote you to contributor, and that will enable you to ask your question. So that's just a housekeeping note. Beyond that, I'm going to talk about our federal funding overview. I'm going to spend just a brief moment on the history of oil and gas in West Virginia. We'll talk about marginal wells, prioritization, a tool that we'll be using called Primo, And then a brief little, just a slide on how to reach us with your comments or questions you may have. So from the top, it's no secret that the state has received lots of funding due to address orphan wells. There are two primary federal acts that have enabled a lot of funding in addition to some increases in state funding. First, from the top, I'll talk about the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It has made available $25 million to plug orphan wells, and that grant has been completed. We plugged 202 wells using that $25 million. The work on those wells was finished up earlier this year. The grant that we're talking about today is the MERP grant made available by the Inflation Reduction Act. We have been awarded $38 million, and we have a 5-year expenditure timeframe for that. We have also been awarded, also under IIJA, Formula Grant Phase 1, $29 million of what is actually a $118 million award, but 29 of that has been awarded so far. And the application period is available for Formula Grant Phase 2, and we are allowed to get up to $45 million from that. We have been awarded a matching grant. It's under the performance series of the IIJA funding. It's a $2 million award for our efforts in fiscal year 24, and we have applied for $3.5 million in fiscal year 25. In addition to that, we have an increase of state funding to the tune of $6 to $9 million annually. So there's a lot of activity. We are certainly in a position to plug a lot of wells. The IIJA wells and our state funds are focused on orphaned wells, but the IRA MERP grant is actually focused on operated wells. So it's a bit of a departure from how we normally go about this. Really quickly, I don't know if this is super pertinent to this presentation, but I always love it. I love to talk about how the oil and gas industry started in West Virginia. I think it's really interesting. It started from salt mining. There was a lot of salt in the area, and people would take these brines and boil them down and use salts, and they would sell the salts. People started drilling salt wells. 1808, Joseph Ruffner drilled the first salt well in West Virginia. It's 59 feet deep. They would collect the brine from this well and more or less boil it down and have salt. And oil was a nuisance byproduct. And they would just boil on by, and they had their nice good salt water. They didn't have to worry about this old oil. But then we had some enterprising gentlemen, John and Cass Rathbone, in 1852, who were collecting oil from the river and selling it. So ultimately, they leased an oil-contaminated salt well in Burning Springs that was producing 7 barrels a day. They decided that they were going to go ahead and drill their own well, and it's the famous Rathbone well, the first oil well producing in West Virginia, and it was 303 feet deep. And then a mere 69 years later, we had our first oil and gas regulations in the state. I think that's interesting, but how does it factor into the MERP grant? And I think we'll see in a moment. So first of all, to set the ground rules, what is a marginal conventional well? The DOE grant defines that. For the purposes of this grant, an MCW is an onshore conventional well producing less than or equal to 15 barrels of oil equivalent per day, or less than or equal to 90,000 cubic feet gas per day over a calendar year. These are producing or idle wells with known operators and well owners. So in order to be eligible for funding, that is the first criteria that must be met. The well has to meet the definition of a marginal conventional well. So I didn't realize I had a little animation in there. How fancy. So let's talk about what we have in West Virginia, and let's talk about how these wells are categorized. Right now, we have about 75,000 documented unplugged wells. Those are divided into idle wells and active wells. And I'll talk about the idle wells first. We have approximately 14,500 idle wells right now, of which 6,000 are orphaned, and 8,500 are operated. Of those 8,500, 500 are what I'm referring to as unconventional. Now, unconventional for the purposes of this slide only, just because I was trying to be very simple, are horizontal wells or coal bed methane wells. Now, when it comes down to it, I'm not saying that coal bed methane wells won't qualify. I'm just saying that for the purpose of this slide, that includes that's where our unconventionals are from. Under active wells, we have just over 60,000 active wells. 55,500 are conventional. 5,000 are unconventional. From our conventional wells, of the 55,500, 55,400 are marginal, and only 100 are not marginal. So the universe of wells that we are looking at are these. These are the wells that qualify, broadly speaking, as marginal conventional wells. 63,262. So just talk about distribution and how active or inactive these wells may be. I just made some arbitrary subsets. I just think it tells an interesting story. If we're looking at wells that produce between 0 and 1 MCF per day, that is 39.6% of our MCWs. 25,029 of those wells. Total production from those 25,000 wells is just under 5,000 MCF per day. If we increase the range to wells that are producing between 1 and 5 MCF per day, that's 29% of our wells. Wells that produce between 5 and 10 MCF per day is 16, and so on until we get to between 50 and 90 MCF per day, and only 0.4% of our wells fall into that category. So in total, we have 63,262 wells, which constitute 313,000 MCF per day, which is 4% of our production. So 63,000 wells represent 4% of the state's production. Just for reference, a note on the bottom under horizontal production, we produce 96% of the state's production, but with 3,500 wells. Those are modern horizontals. We want to talk about how the marginal conventional wells are broken up by operator. Tells quite a bit of a different story. If you look at operators who operate between 0 and 10 wells, that is 77% of operators. Those 77% of operators have 1,200 wells. 2% of the total marginal wells are operated by 77% of operators. And again, with arbitrary breakdowns, operators that have between 11 and 50 wells, there's 144 of them, representing 10% of the operators, and 2,800 wells. Operators that have between 51 and 100 wells is another 4%, and it kind of just decreases from there. And ultimately, we have 9 operators that have at least 1,000 wells. 0.6% of operators have collectively 28,500 marginal conventional wells, or 45% of the total. So we're charged with prioritizing these. So the grant itself gives us basically three criteria. One is that our prioritization process must include methane and other greenhouse gas emissions, with a priority given to the higher methane emitters based on pre-existing data or initial screening of methane emissions. We have to consider proximity to disadvantaged communities as defined by CGIST, which the acronym escapes me because I'm on the spot, but it's the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. Also, the third is location of the marginal conventional wells on tribal lands. West Virginia, we don't have any active tribal lands at this time. So our prioritization model, whatever that looks like at the end of the process, must include methane emissions and proximity to disadvantaged communities. And I want to keep in mind, participation in this program is entirely voluntary. At no time will we or can we mandate that a well be plugged. It has to be on a completely voluntary basis. The grant further says that the prioritization process may consider other factors without limitation. We may consider current production rates, potential impacts to small businesses, impacts on access to oil and gas within disadvantaged communities where utilities that offer that oil and gas are not otherwise available, landowner or other operator agreements, impacts on surface and groundwater quality, climate and human health impacts, risk of the well becoming orphaned, post-plugging land use, or other state priorities. So I'd like to talk a little bit about disadvantaged communities. This is a map of the CGIS tool. I hope everybody can see good contrast, but all of the areas that are shaded in the tan brown, those are disadvantaged communities in West Virginia, and it according to CGIS tool, and it represents the vast majority of the state. If you want to look at where the wells are, the 63,262, you will see that 45,841 of them are in disadvantaged communities. 72% of the wells fall within those areas. So DOE has funded its NETL branch to develop a prioritization software model for states to use, and we will be using it. It's called Primo. And this is some West Virginia data that NETL has provided. We provided them data, they provide us some preliminary work. I'm going to show you a little bit of prioritization and what that may look like. This is all just some factors that we made up to show proof of concept. These are no way final priorities that have been chosen. This is just something to show how the system might work and how these factors that we're developing, the factors that we're getting feedback for, will ultimately be used to prioritize wells. So this is just a screenshot from Primo. All of our marginal conventional well location data has been populated. Data for each of the wells is provided using GIS tools. In this example, we are looking at hospitals, schools. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I remember that buildings is actually urban areas. They're giving a submetric rate. We also look at annual gas production, and we look at 5-year production for oil and gas. This is just for demonstration purposes. But the idea is that each of these factors are weighted, and a score is given to them ultimately to decide how they're prioritized. And what ends up getting spit out is a list of wells that are ranked. And in this example, I'll point out those some of these headings that have been used in this example. Well count. You can get a score between 0 and 20 based on the number of wells. So if the prioritization comes to how many wells do you own, maybe you could say the fewer wells you own, get a higher score for well count. If you have more wells, you get a lower score. And by weighting them, you can offset things. If you have a bad well, it could be plugged regardless. If you have wells that are a little more in the middle, it may make a difference. But again, this is just illustrative. Here is a disadvantaged community score between 0 and 30. So a well in a disadvantaged community, they get a score of 30 or 50 or 20 or 10 or whatever it works out. Whereas a well that is not will be a lower score. That way it's not excluded from being plugged. It's just, it may not have as high of a priority. In this example, hospitals were used. Hospitals within 500 meters, score between 0 and 10. And as you can see, there was one well, first on the list, did get a score for being close to a hospital. We have schools within 100 meters or 500 meters. We have urbanized areas. We have an annual production score. So wells that produce either higher or lower may be able to get some sort of prorated score. 5-year production. So in this example, we have, what is that, 7 wells, and you can see that they have been prioritized with a high score of 93 and a low score of 87. So by using and implementing these these criteria, whatever ultimately they may be, we can adjust weights, we can incorporate different criteria, however it works, and whatever the community gives us to work with, we can develop that. And in doing so, we can ultimately decide which wells will be plugged and which wells will not. One of the neat things about Primo is that it then takes data and allows you to develop customized well plugging packages. And this is more of a benefit for us on the end, but I think it's really neat. You can define, broadly speaking, what is an idealized plugging package. Wells within 5 miles of each other, or wells that are of a certain vintage, or wells that target a certain formation, those kinds of things. And it will mine the data and give you these clusters of wells that would, quote, make a good package. Obviously, this is just a fancy whiz bang, but it is a really nice whiz bang to have. So ultimately, once we have a fully populated data set, we'll likely use this kind of data to focus on the most efficient projects that we can develop for cost savings, so we can plug as many wells as possible. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the audience. I'll just say the question on the table is, what factors make sense to include in a prioritization model? And I'll also add that we have an email address we've mentioned a couple times, DEP-MERP at wv.gov. We will select, or we will accept written comments or suggestions to that email box until the date that Terry has specified, I think a week from today, 5 p.m. And at this point, I'll open the floor for comments from the audience, both here and on the computer. Any questions? Can I clarify anything?
As far as running Primo, it's only the wells that have been volunteered, right? It's not, you're not going to go.
These are the only wells that will be populated in the Primo selection are ultimately the wells that are, okay, there's two aspects to this. All the nominated wells will go in.
Oh, yeah, not
All the nominated wells will go in. Those will be ranked and prioritized.
Nominates the wells.
The operators themselves will nominate the wells. There is an outside chance that I could see where another stakeholder may nominate a well, but ultimately it is a voluntary process and the operator would have to. So let's say you are a landowner and you say, I would like to have this well nominated. I think that pathway is open, but it has to be consensual. So if the operator says, oh yeah, that's fine, it makes sense to plug this well, then that well would be eligible. If the operator says, no, thank you, the well would not be eligible.
Jason, just to kind of reiterate something I heard earlier. Once wells are nominated, once the criteria are out, once they're located or plotted on a map, and you start with your highest priority wells, there would also be an efficiency factor in there that would say a lower priority well that is within several hundred feet or a couple thousand feet from where you're plugging could be considered because you have a rig there, you have the manpower there, those kind of things. Does that make sense?
I think that we have shown time and again in our existing plugging programs that grouping wells together in packages does add efficiencies. We will work on a priority basis for these wells because we have to make sure that, we don't want to jump around too much because, we have an obligation to plug, the highest priority wells. But I think there are opportunities potentially for efficiencies. Just an example that I've used before, let's say that the highest priority well is in Doddridge County. Let's say that maybe 6 of the top 20 are in Doddridge County, so to speak. It may make sense to go ahead and plug those 6. But again, we will explore avenues for efficiency, but we do have an obligation to follow the prioritization, and we don't want to jump down to the bottom of the list and miss something higher priority ultimately. But and I haven't said this, but I do think that we could potentially plug as many as 400 wells with this grant funding. Obviously, that depends on cost, and we've made a lot of assumptions in getting to that number, but it is $38 million, and we wanted to go as far as possible for maximum.
And try an online participant.
Absolutely.
Okay, Brian Jarvis, I'm just turning on my speaker one moment. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, there we go. Hey, Jason, Brian Jarvis. I was wondering how you plan on going about determining how these wells are plugged, or the way that they're going to be chosen to be plugged based on the pluggers for the state, because I know a lot of operators are small. They probably don't have relationships with companies that can do that work. And I just wonder how it'll go about being done.
Okay. I'm going to assume. Yes. Okay. I'm going to assume that everybody heard that question. Well, I'll just repeat it. The question is how do we then, at the point at which DEP has a prioritized well list, how do we actually go about contracting the wells to be plugged? And the answer to that is that we are going to use our existing purchasing procedures. So we will not be giving money to operators directly. What we will do is we will, from our prioritized well list, we will gather the wells that make sense to plug, and those will be put out for bid as we do all of our other well plugging packages. So those follow our state purchasing procedures, and they are awarded on the formal definition is lowest cost bidder meeting specs. So we will run those through our normal channels, and they'll be available to bid on by interested parties.
Chats on phones too.
Those are unofficial channels.
They are.
Does anybody, I'll try to prod a little bit. Does anybody have opinions on how wells should be chosen? What factors should be considered?
This is our question. How the operators will know that they are in that list of priority wells?
Those details are a little unclear. So the question for anybody, and just in case no one heard, the question is, how will operators know where they are on the priority list? And the priority, so the process, broadly speaking, and it's a little undefined at this point, but just for sake of conversation, the process will include, there will be a nomination process. So we will have a form, picture in your mind a single page form where an operator can take and say, this is my well API number, this I'm nominating. And it'll have certain information. And that information will tie directly back to the criteria that has been established. We may ask, I don't know, any number of questions. I can't really envision it right now, but since we talked about hospitals, maybe we'll say, are there hospitals within 500 meters? If that is one of the criteria used. So I didn't mention there's another part to this. So once we have collected all of this data, we will be performing methane emission quantification on all nominated wells. So we will go out and we have a contract that we're getting in place right now, hopefully finalized pretty soon. But this contract will be for a vendor to go out and analyze how much methane is being emitted. And that data will also populate the prioritization table. So then it will just be top down. That list of that prioritized well list will be published. It'll be published on our website and for the world to see, as will the prioritization model. So before we accept the first nomination, the the prioritization model will be finalized and made public. So everybody will know before we accept any nominations how their wells will be scored in advance of submitting. Did I answer the question? Okay, thank you. Sure.
Knowing that not everything is set in stone yet. And one assume that there is in no way any attempt to penalize a producer who might offer a well that when upon inspection is determined to be leaking or causing an environmental concern that was that the department was unaware of prior to the submission.
So the question, in case anybody didn't hear online, the question is, will operators expect any backhand regulatory action as a stick rather than a carrot when applying for these wells? And to that, I would say there's no way as a regulatory agency, if somebody brings us a real disaster, a problem that should be addressed, that we can't not address it. That is not the intention of this stuff. Obviously, I mean, if you look at the language I read with how we are supposed to prioritize wells, it clearly states that we are supposed to give higher priority to wells that are leaking more. I think that we can all agree that a well leaking is in a non-compliant state as it is. So we have to prioritize that well. That well moves up the list for leaking, not down the list. There is no effort by this agency, nor is there effort by the DOE/EPA to use this as a backhand enforcement method. Obviously, if we run into problems that fall outside of this that may need to be addressed, we may have to address them. There's no such thing as amnesty, per se. But we certainly understand that the scope of this is intended to help operators address leaking wells by funding the plugging of their wells. Notices of violation, things that other enforcement actions don't. That's not the intent. So I can't say that there's blanket amnesty. There's no way that that's practical. But we are prioritizing wells that are in bad condition. And those are the wells that will be funded.
The prioritization, is it from 0 to 100?
So
What you say in your example of the 7, one was 87, one was 90 something, or the high and the low was from 87 to like 96.
I think that, so the question is what will the range of prioritization be? Is it an implied scale of 0 to 100? And I think that that's an arbitrary designation in the model. I think it likely that we use that. I think that because 100 make nice round numbers, probably, but we're under no obligation to limit it to 100. If the score ends up being out of 612, it ends up being out of 612. So it's just that's an arbitrary designation. No matter what it is, it'll be the highest scores that are.
I thought there were fixed ranges on each of the criteria.
We have the latitude to define those fixed ranges when we are creating the prioritization criteria. We could subweight them. We could say this factor gets a 10%, and as I said, it's probable that we'll end up at 100 because it's nice round numbers. But there are weightings and subweightings, and those are all things that will be decided, hopefully based on some feedback from this meeting. That will take that information and develop it into some sort of coherent model that makes sense and satisfies the public feedback.
You answered the second part of my question was, what if they're tied? But I heard 7 wells landing that close together.
I'm
have subsets in it.
right. And also there are, once we start factoring in real data from methane emissions, I'm hopeful that there won't actually be any direct ties, but if there are ties, then plug those wells. When you've got deep pockets, those are not bad problems. It's, you know, when things are tight and you have to decide between one and two, that's where or struggle, which is where we've been historically. Historically, our abandoned well plugging program has been severely underfunded. Now we're, as you can tell, we're very well funded. So, you know, now we just try to make up for lost time. Yes, sir.
Is there any kind of corresponding program for abandoned wells?
Do you mean orphaned wells? Absolutely. Yes, we, all of the funding, all of the funding sources that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, these are all except for the highlighted one, these are all directed towards orphan well plugging. On our website, I'll have a shameless plug. We have a reporting tool for landowners or anybody to report an orphan well. They can go to our website, type in some basic information, some contact information. We'll get back to you and go get the well inspected and ranked accordingly.
Is there on that website, does it already show the ones that have been reported?
No, it does not. However, we have a mapping tool on the website, and that mapping tool currently shows all of the wells that were plugged under the IIJA initial grant. As we plug more wells with other funding sources, as wells are plugged, they will be populated in this database, and this database will show all the wells. It will show what their methane emissions were pre and post plugging. It will show who the contractor was. It will show who the operator was. It will show how much money was spent plugging those wells. And this is available now on our website. It just has data for the initial grant primarily because that was what that's the biggest thing we've accomplished so far.
I'm going to ask again, Jason, one more question. Assuming that maybe many of the wells that will be submitted voluntarily might contain tanks, above-ground storage tanks on site. The regulations for how tanks are decommissioned and removed, does that remain with the operator who has submitted the well, or does that become part of the automatically become part of the plugging process?
So the question for everyone online, if you didn't hear, was what becomes of tanks specifically, because there are extensive regulations around the decommissioning of tanks. So if a well is attached to a tank that already has regulations on it is encountered, who is ultimately responsible for making sure that the tank decommissioning is accomplished? Is that correct?
You got it, Jason.
I gave a very long-winded rephrasing of that because I was stalling. I will tell you that has not been considered in any way at this time, and I do not know the answer. I will figure out how that works, but it'd be premature for me right now to speculate.
And if I may, that might consider ground disturbance and other factors that play into the removal of the tanks outside of that.
I will say that in general, the way it works in our orphan well plugging program is that salvage, we call that, we refer to it as a waste stream. DOI refers to it as salvage. We consider that, it's a longstanding tenet in our Abandoned Well Plugging Act that the interested party plugging the well has the right of first refusal on any of those materials. If they don't want it, the landowner can have it, and if the landowner doesn't want it, then the interested party plugging the well has the obligation to dispose of that in accordance with it. So obviously, when we get into tank decommissioning, this is not merely a salvage situation. There are regulatory hooks attached to those, and I can't speak to that right now. But I will I will try to find the answer. Thank you, Trevor.
Are the 6,000 orphan wells going to be nominated automatically or by West Virginia DEP?
No, sir. This is, orphan wells are not eligible for plugging.
They are going to stay out.
This is the spirit of the MERP grant is to target the, and I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth, but I'm about doing that. I believe it's 11% of fugitive methane emissions are tied to oil and gas industry from marginal commissioning wells. This is meant to focus on that 11%. So orphan wells, while admittedly may also be emitting methane or other greenhouse gases, that is not the focus of this grant. But idle wells are eligible if they meet the criteria for prioritization, whatever that ultimately is. Sir?
Dave McMahon with Surface Centers. I just want to speak to say I don't want to sandbag anybody. I have to put on the committee that's going to make some of these influence on these decisions. And I will certainly make known the Surface Owners' Rights Organization's positions. For example, if it's a leak that's coming up the outside of the casing, to us, that's a more important thing for money to get plugged than one that's got a leak somewhere on the wellhead. If after you get all the leaky wells done, you've got a free gas well, we'd rather you didn't plug the free gas well. And there are other things like that that we're going to comment about. I didn't want you guys to think that we weren't. We certainly think that the idea is to get wells plugged, or kind of our overall theme is to get wells plugged that wouldn't otherwise get plugged because this money is available. So I just wanted to not sandbag anybody and let you have had communications among ourselves on the committee, and I'm sure our plan is to make a final recommendation at the last meeting with more specific detail.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And the other thing is we prefer a truly idle well over one that's very marginal, because somebody may be getting a royalty, and let's not plug that if there's something else that's otherwise kind of equal.
Thank you for those comments.
And thank you, Jason, for the committee work and this work putting this together. Much appreciated, everybody involved.
Thank you very much. I will add that I have a stock response. It is thank you for your feedback. We will consider that, but it's especially ironic given that David is on the committee. So I will say, I'll thank you for your feedback that you will ultimately consider. The good news is that you have me till 8, so I can do this all night.
Maybe you could show the slide of the suggested factors that can come into it. It's a big long list.
Sure. Sorry for that. This one.
Yeah, just to get people thinking and say yay or nay on some of these.
Okay. I'll certainly entertain any feedback on any of these individual things or any others, of course.
Just wondering how this might tie to Hope Gas abandoning lines. Probably doesn't.
There are
Abandoning lines and therefore field taps.
so I know that the MERP grant itself has several phases. One of which is we call this MERP 1. There's another opportunity, $350 million, I believe. I think there's, oh gosh, don't quote me. I think 1.5 billion available for under MERP 2. MERP 2 is meant to address solutions to mitigate emissions of methane without necessarily plugging wells. So there's a focus on repairs. There's a focus on monitoring. I certainly think that something like, low pressure gathering line systems that may have, leaks, I certainly think that those repair efforts would perhaps fall under MERP 2. I'll talk a little bit about that one in a moment. Under MERP 1 is it strictly plug and play. So I don't necessarily know how line decommissioning, I know how we deal with locally when we plug a well. I don't know how it would work with broader based systems. But to close the loop on MERP 2, those applications under MERP 2, they were very large grants. I think that one was 300 million, one was 210 million. We're targeted towards and will be awarded ultimately to nationwide level approaches to address leaking infrastructure, monitoring systems, things of that nature. So those should be awarded, I believe, sometime in December. Yes,
Brian would like to speak again.
we'll allow it.
Hey, Jace, I just want to say you and your team did a great job explaining this complicated issue. I was just wondering, you're probably going to get a lot of requests pretty rapidly. Is there, what do you think the timeline will be from the point of acceptance of your form to actually getting wells plugged?
I think.
Okay.
Okay, we're muted. I tell you what, second time's a charm. So I believe that we expect to be plugging wells in the middle of next year. Is that what the middle of next year? We have a lot of there's a lot of steps to get there. But I believe that the middle of next year is what we're targeting to start plugging wells. I hope to be able to accept well nominations early next year.
Jason, can you, Charlie Bird here, can you maybe expand just a little bit what a landowner agreement might, what you think a landowner agreement might include? I'm assuming that a producer offering a well already has obviously accesses, right of ways and that sort of thing to get to the well, to service it, pull charts, that kind of thing. Does that agreement, as it's mentioned on the screen, does that encompass more land access and that sort of thing?
So the question is what do landowner and operator agreements mean? And my honest answer is I don't know. I copied this from the grant language, and I don't know what was envisioned when it was drafted. I do think that what is intended by this entire section is to make it clear that this is free form, that the state, through the community outreach process, has the latitude to incorporate the factors that matter to the communities at that level. So while I can't tell you what a landowner operator agreement is, somebody in their mind had one, but we're not beholden to that. And if somebody comes up with an idea and they think it needs to be prioritized, we would certainly be happy to consider it. But I don't know what was intended by that particular.
I just wonder if it, in the government's world, does landowner agreement and lease agreement kind of coincide a bit? I mean, generally there would be a lease agreement, well, which would give you certain parameters.
And that may be what's intended by that. And I just.
That's what I would say when we deal with people out of state. But the surface and minerals are owned by different people. My guess is that they're imagining fee agreements.
Could be.